There we are. So Reconstruction was the 12-year period after the Civil War, 1865 to 1877. War's over. What are the issues that remain? You might want to pause this here and just take a moment to think, okay, the North has won. What is left to deal with? Here's some facts and a little background. First, the South is devastated. All but 2 battles of the war are fought in the South. About 1 million soldiers fought for the Confederacy, and over a quarter of them are dead, 289,000 Confederate soldiers. On the other hand, I'll just note that there are about 380,000 Union soldiers that are dead as well, but the South has proportionally lost more. When Sherman went through the West, or the Army of the West, when he had marched to the sea through Georgia, he had destroyed everything in his path that could be of use to the Confederacy. Railroad tracks, plantations. He had said when he started the march, "I can make Georgia howl," and he just kind of burned everything, as I had talked about in class. A lot of wartime destruction. On top of that, the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union armies had freed all the slaves of the South, and the 13th Amendment had finished that off. And so the South's economic system is gone. Slavery is abolished. Obviously that's a good thing, but what does that leave in its place? You have destroyed the economy. Now what's going to happen? So there are 2 questions for the government. How is Honest Abe, the rail splitter, going to knit the country back together? The first one is political. On what terms should the southern states be readmitted? How are they going to come back in? And you have all these freedmen, the former slaves. How is the federal government going to make sure that their rights get protected and that a region that has enslaved them for, by this point, about 250 years, from the 1600s on, is going to overnight somehow treat them equally? Just if you think in terms of the movie 12 Years a Slave, pretty difficult to just overnight or in a short amount of time establish equal relations. In terms of readmittance, that is a disturbing photograph of the Battle of Gettysburg and the war dead. The chapter title from the textbook is To Punish or Forgive, and that's really a good way to think about the argument that raged in the North about how to readmit the Confederate states. Should we punish them or should we forgive them? What does that mean? To forgive means that, it's like a family fight. We squabbled, it's over, let's move on, come back to the dinner table, and let's go back to how things were as quickly as possible. And underneath that is the idea that the Confederate States never really left, because that was Lincoln's argument from the beginning, is they could not be allowed to leave, so they never really left. Let's readmit them as quickly and painlessly as possible. Many people had trouble with that idea. It was a bloody, bloody war. It was the worst war in our history, even up until now. And people couldn't forget the loss of their sons, their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, and they wanted to never forget the bloodshed. Those people wanted to break the South. They wanted to punish them, and they wanted the rich people of the South to not have their way of life that they had before. So there were 2 plans, the hard, punishing plan and the soft plan of forgiveness. Lincoln, can you guess which plan he would want? Why don't you take a guess now? Had one plan, and it's the soft. As I've said before, he had a tremendous capacity for empathy, and he wanted to just move the country forward. However, there were Republicans who were angry, and they wanted the hard plan. And many Republicans were actually bitterly opposed to Lincoln's terms of forgiveness. That plan is summed up by the Wade-Davis plan. Benjamin Wade and I forget what Davis's first name is, had that plan in Congress. It got passed, and Lincoln eventually vetoed it. That's a picture of Lincoln in his second inaugural address, and might be his most famous address. It's probably the shortest inaugural speech in history, but maybe the best. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So his goal is to have the southern states rejoin the U.S. as quickly as possible and do not treat the South as a defeated nation. What's the method? Well, he wanted a certain percent of Southern voters, of Confederate state voters, would be required to take an oath of loyalty to the Union before they'd be readmitted. What percent would that be? Would it take 90%? Would it take 50%? If you have 50% of the Confederate voters in a state saying they'll take an oath of allegiance, would you let them back in? Lincoln's plan was scarily soft. 10%. Once 10% of the residents took an oath, he'd let them back in, as long as they ratified the new 13th Amendment. When we talk about an easy plan for readmittance and forgiveness, this is probably the most forgiving plan possible. Lincoln might have been able to pull it off. I think if any president was going to bind the nation together, it might have been him, but it might have been too demanding a job. So what happened, of course, is John Wilkes Booth shoots him April of 1865 when the war has just ended, and we never get to see what Lincoln would have done. What comes after Lincoln? Well, actually, the state of Tennessee comes into play. Andrew Johnson becomes president. Who is he? He is a former slave owner. He is a Democrat, not a Republican, and he's a senator from Tennessee. Why would that have happened? Why would Lincoln, a Republican, and the Republican Party have nominated a Democratic slave owner from a state that seceded to be vice president? That's a strange story. It goes back to 1864 when he was elected. The Republicans were worried that they were going to lose the election, and they were trying to collect votes. So they decided to nominate a Republican or a Democrat as vice president. They chose Johnson because he had stayed loyal. When Tennessee seceded, he, as a senator, had still gone to the Senate and had announced that he was loyal to the Union. And he had been part of the efforts to retake Tennessee. At one point, Lincoln had named him the Union governor of Tennessee, and then he eventually put him on the Republican ticket. So the Republicans chose him as a fusion candidate to fusing the Democrats and the Republicans to try and attract votes. They never expected him to be president, and so all of a sudden, this is the key point, the Democratic president is in charge of the government, and the radical Republicans are in charge of Congress, and those are going to battle. Johnson's plan. There he is. In some ways, it's a continuation of Lincoln's plan. Still the 10%, still the ratification of the 13th Amendment. But it wasn't really the ratification or a continuation of Lincoln's plan, because he did nothing to actually hold the southern states to especially treating the freedmen, the ex-slaves, in any kind of way, given any kind of equality. So the southern states all held conventions for Reconstruction, but they weren't forced to follow any really strict plans. And very quickly, the Confederate leaders kind of get back in control and pass a bunch of laws that prohibit blacks. Those are called the Black Codes. Note that these are not the same things same thing as Jim Crow laws. It's different. This is in about 1866, right after the Civil War. Blacks were not allowed to carry guns in these states. They weren't allowed to start businesses. They weren't allowed to come out on streets after sundown. They weren't allowed to rent or lease farmland. They weren't allowed to be traveling through the countryside without some sort of permit. What does this sound like? Well, it sounds like slavery under a different name. And the southern states argued that these black codes were necessary to keep order. The radical Republicans thought that it was just another way of having slavery. And that's really what it was. So the radical Republicans fight back. And they have such strong majorities in Congress that they are able to override many of Johnson's vetoes and do what they want. On the left is Charles Sumner, the senator, the one who'd gotten beaten before the war in Congress. And on the right is Thaddeus Stevens, a representative in the House of Representatives, strict abolitionist, and were often upset with Lincoln that he wasn't doing enough during the war to get rid of slavery. By the way, in the movie Lincoln, Tommy Lee Jones plays the man on the right. Their goals: punish the South like a defeated nation and increase the rights of the freedmen. Their method is to use the military. They send the army back in and occupy the South with federal troops. The troops would be withdrawn only when the states adopt constitutions acceptable to Congress. And some of those troops stayed for the entire time of Reconstruction. No Confederate leaders were allowed to empower. And then they went after Andrew Johnson for his impeachment policies, or for his Reconstruction policies, and they impeached him. It wasn't a really valid reason to impeach him. They kind of laid a trap and set up a rule that he couldn't fire any of his cabinet members. But his cabinet members had been left over from Lincoln and were openly working against him. And so he fired one of them, and they impeached him. And if you remember, that's a two-step process. The House brings the impeachment charges, and then the Senate does the trial. So he was impeached, but the Senate came one vote short of removing him from office, so he remained in office. They also passed policies to help the freedmen. What were these policies? Number one, they passed laws and amendments to establish rights. They passed a Civil Rights Act, which Johnson promptly vetoed, and then they passed it with an override, but they eventually passed an amendment to get around it. So first of all, they passed the 13th Amendment, which we talked about in class. Second, they passed the 14th Amendment, which was really an amendment to fix Dred Scott. Remember, Dred Scott had ruled that blacks could never be citizens and had no rights. So the 14th Amendment is maybe the most important amendment after the first in our whole Constitution. It says that all citizens born in the United States, all people born in the United States have citizenship and equality and are to be treated with due process under the laws. That's a very important amendment. The 15th Amendment established voting rights for blacks. Could not be denied the vote. The Radical Republicans also established the Freedmen's Bureau, which was designed to assist ex-slaves in the South. And if you think about it, and think in terms of the movie, slaves are freed, but they have no property, no money, no literacy, and often have been separated from their families. And the Freedmen's Bureau is designed to set up some schools, help freedmen find work, and say they go back to work for their old plantation master, they try to get them to be treated as workers and not as slaves. And it's really was an admirable bureau, but had just a huge task, and their funding ended up getting cut. There were proposals to do more. The radical Republicans wanted to break up the big plantations and really punish those large slave owners and redistribute the land to the poor whites and the poor blacks. The impact of all of this was limited. The challenges were huge and the funding was cut. The amendments were not enforced, and so until the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s, these things didn't do much. At least the amendments were on the books. Kind of stuck here, I don't know why. I'm going to break out of this, sorry about that. Let's play it again. We're at 14:52, although I think I didn't start timing right away, so it's probably longer than that. Go to that one. We're almost done. That's not true. The end of Reconstruction. By the mid-1870s, Northern whites had grown tired of Reconstruction. They had their own problems. There's a picture of a riot in New York City being broken up by the police over unemployment and wages. The Civil War was now 10 years ago, and memories were fading. The Democratic Party was able to regain political control of the South, and the Solid South is a term that for decades each Confederate state or ex-Confederate state voted solidly Democratic, so that's what that Solid South means. The Radical Republicans lost control of Congress, and in the election of 1876, it was a disputed election. Wasn't sure who won in the Electoral College, Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, or Rutherford B. Hayes, a Republican. And in the end, the Democrats and the Republicans cut a deal. The Republicans could have the win. Hayes could be president, and the Democrats would get an end to Reconstruction. And so the last of the federal troops were removed a year later. What's the aftermath of Reconstruction? First of all, blacks went from being slaves to sharecroppers. We'll talk more about that in class, hopefully, but sharecropping means you don't own the land. You are allowed that the big landowner still owns it all, and you're allowed to live on the land and grow crops and then share your production with the landowner. It's not quite as bad as slavery, but it's not much better. So that's the economics. Politically, there are massive restrictions on black rights. And starting in the 1880s, the Jim Crow laws, which lasted for about 70 years, mandating segregation in most public facilities, including schools. And then you get the rise of the KKK, vigilante that intimidated people who would help blacks and kind of enforced the new rules that blacks were to be kept socially inferior. And then there were a number of things to prevent blacks from voting. Poll tax, you had to pay a tax to vote. Literacy tests that were so hard that nobody could pass them, but there was a grandfather clause that if your grandfather had voted, you could be allowed to vote. And of course, only the grandfathers of whites had voted, so that was a way of allowing whites to vote, even if they couldn't pass these tests, and keep blacks from voting. And then, of course, the KKK intimidated anybody who tried to go against these new rules. In 1896, Homer Plessy tried to ride a train car that was segregated, and case ended up going to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in their decision that separate but equal was constitutional. And so what that did is it made the Jim Crow laws that I had just talked about were considered constitutional until 1954. Oops, I meant to circle that, sorry. Sorry about that. KKK really three eras: Reconstruction, 1920s, 1950s, and 60s. This is the Reconstruction time. All right, just quickly, check and evaluation. What were the two issues of Reconstruction? What were the two approaches? That's an easy one. Which approach did Lincoln want, and what did the radical Republicans want? How does Andrew Johnson fit into all of this and these arguments about the approaches to the southern states? How successful was Reconstruction in reintegrating the South? And what I probably didn't cover well enough was that the South remained backwards economically and devastated for many, many years. And it was only way behind the North that it actually industrialized and began to catch up. How successful was Reconstruction in protecting the rights of ex-freedmen or ex-slaves? You can answer that one. What grade would you give Reconstruction? Be prepared to explain that. And that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.